Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com here, and today I would like to talk about something that might seem a little bit off topic, and that is changing your name legally. Now, I have a kind of an interesting personal story as to why I have an interest in this topic, and I'll relate that in just a minute, but first let me say that this video is essentially going to be divided into two different parts. So the first part of it is going to be this anecdote, this personal story that explains my interest. The second part of the video is actually going to be the information about how to change your name legally. So for those people who may have found this video and are trying to get to that information, I'm going to have a link in the description, a jumping off point, so that you can just click that and jump right to the section of the video where the information is, and you can skip over the story if it's of no interest. But before I relate either of the two things, I'm going to give my necessary disclaimer. So first of all, I'm not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice of any kind. So please, this is for general, informational, and entertainment purposes only, and is not intended to be legal advice. So my dad, Jim, as I've related, died in 2016, but actually he was not born Jim. His name, of course, Jim is usually a nickname for James, but he wasn't born James either. His given name at birth was Hugh Victor Bell Jr. And, of course, his father's name, my grandpa, that I never met, was Hugh Victor Bell Sr. So, interesting story. He lived apparently for many, many years calling himself Jim. Now, the circumstances of this change are unclear to me. I am not aware of the actual full story, because by the time I discovered this information, my dad was already beyond the point where I would be able to meaningfully have a conversation with him about it. But essentially, the way that I have reconstructed things is my dad's mom, my grandma, died when he was 11 or 12 years old, so in the year 1941, thereabouts. And at that time, I think my dad, because he was so close to his mom, there was some connection there with the name, and he started to call himself Jim, essentially. And apparently the family just followed suit. I mean, it seems strange to me now, but I don't know. Maybe it was different times back then. And when he became working age, he just gave the name James Bell, Jim. And that's the way people knew him at work. That's the way he got his Social Security card. That's the way all his employment records showed. Ultimately, when he got a driver's license, his driver's license also reflected the name James. And it wasn't until my mom married him, and he was married as James as well, that she started to notice there were a few things that came in the mail, and they were addressed to Hugh. And she said, well, this is obviously for your dad. And he just kind of said, yeah, okay. But it came out shortly. I think it was an invitation to go to a high school reunion or something along the lines of this, that finally brought the situation out into the open. And when my mom discovered it, she pressed him to go through some actual process to have his name legally changed. And what he eventually did, at the advice of a lawyer, was to have his older sister sign an affidavit which basically indicated that James Bell was Hugh Bell, and that seemed to satisfy all of the requirements that were necessary. It had to be an older sibling, because that person had to have some kind of a familiarity with the birth circumstances or be present or whatever. But it raised the issue. My dad was born obviously at a different time. Things were less litigious than they are now. And it's just kind of an interesting story, but it does raise the question for those people who might be in a similar situation: what are the actual legalities? Now, this might seem a bit strange to cover on a channel about Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairments, but what occurs to me is that there may be a number of people who might be in a position of caring for older relatives. And I've run across similar situations to this, not exactly the same, but similar situations with missing birth certificates. And so I will actually address some of these other situations in subsequent videos. But for right now, I want to say that there are actually two different, let's say, name change scenarios that I'm going to address. The first one is essentially a marriage situation, and the second, we'll just call it a non-marriage situation. So in a marriage situation, you get married, let's say, And here we're specifically mostly thinking about women, and this is because of the history of the law development in this country and indeed in Western society. But in a marriage situation, essentially the only document that one needs in order to start the process of changing the name, and it is a kind of a process. It's not like there's one sort of one-stop shop where you change your name once and then it kind of magically changes it in all places. Maybe we're moving to that, but as of right now, it's something of a process. But the only document you really need in a marriage situation is going to be your marriage certificate. Now, you have to think, when you are in the process of getting married, you'll probably obtain a marriage license, and that license will probably be gotten from the county clerk. Once you get married, you'll have your marriage certificate, and that'll be signed by all parties, including the witness or the officiant or presider, and then that will be filed with usually the county clerk's office. And then you will actually use that marriage certificate to obtain the other documentation that's going to be necessary for the name change. So you're going to get your Social Security card changed. You contact the Social Security Administration. The IRS also suggests that this is a hugely important piece to the name change. Secondarily, you will use your new marriage certificate as well as your Social Security card that you obtain to change your driver's license. Once you have those two pieces of identification, pretty much everything else kind of falls into place. With those two pieces, the marriage certificate and the Social Security card, the driver's license, you'll be able to do things like, change your name on file with the post office if you choose to do that, change voter registration documents, and this is just concentrating kind of on government types of things. I would say the next sort of batch of things you're going to want to be concerned with are going to be those that have to do with your money. Now, money can come into you and you put money out. So when you think about, let's say, money coming into you, you're going to be thinking about changing your name with your employer, changing your name with any brokerage or investment companies that you are associated with, your bank. Then you're going to move into sort of where the money is flowing out. And here you're going to be talking about things like your credit card companies, your landlord, so where you pay your mortgage or rent, utility companies, so, electric and gas and trash pickup and water and all the rest of the utilities. Probably want to see if there's a process that might be applicable for any homeowners association or anything along the lines of that. Any miscellaneous loan holders, other kinds of professional licenses or other kinds of things that you might hold. And then there's just going to be kind of everything else. This might be attorneys that you have relationships with, and in particular, if you have documentation such as living trusts or other kinds of trusts or wills, if you're named on, deeds to real property or beneficiary deeds, that's the kind of thing you're going to want to think through next. Doctors' offices, they're going to update, of course, medical records to reflect the name change. Probably also want to contact institutions of learning, schools, and the like of that. They're going to change things like enrollment records. They're going to change, or at least update, pen the name change onto your transcript requests and things like this. But once again, it's a process. Now, if you have, again, a marriage situation, then once again, the marriage license pretty much is going to be the catalyst to be able to trigger these changes. But in a non-marriage situation, pretty much the beginning point is going to be a petition you're going to file with the court. Now, there are going to be limitations on the kinds of things that you're going to be able to petition the court with respect to. So, for instance, and this is just obvious, but I have to state it anyway, and that is that you can't change your name for committing a crime. You can't change your name to escape prosecution or to escape debts. You can't change your name to defraud or mislead anybody, and so on. But what you're going to have to do on the petition usually is to give cause, give some reason why you are attempting to change your name. And then there's going to be limitations on what you can change your name to. You can't change your name to certain words, profanities, or you can't take on a celebrity's name, and things like this. Once you have filed that petition with the court, then there will be some sort of a review process. Often this is somewhat pro forma. It may involve the requirement that you put forward some sort of a paid advertisement or paid announcement in a newspaper or other public place. in order to basically give creditors and other people a chance to track along with the name change, possibly object to it. And this is similar to in the marriage ceremony, where often you'll hear about a place where the presider will say something like, "Is there anyone present who objects?" Ultimately, if you prevail in your cause, then the judge will issue a decree allowing for the name change. You might think of this as a court order, and then it will be that document, the court order or the decree, that you will use to get the Social Security card, the driver's license, to change the bank accounts and everything that we kind of just sketched. Now, just talking about cost for a minute, you can do this without a lawyer. Much of this, that's called representing yourself pro se or for yourself. There will still be court costs, filing fees, copying fees, possibly notary fees, and the like of this. You can't escape those. But you can also hire a lawyer, and if you do that, presumably the lawyer will, for the most part, take the reins and simply ask you for information and signatures from time to time. And in that case, you're going to pay certain legal fees on top of whatever other court filing fees and so on are required. Just a couple of final things to think about. Common law basically is a law, a body of law that proceeds from custom, proceeds from use, proceeds from precedent, basically, instead of from legislation or statute. And common law has a number of curious and interesting, from a historical point of view, particularly in our day and age here, has a couple of things that are somewhat interesting. The first is the idea that you are able to change your name by usage. So in other words, like my dad did, he just started calling himself by the name of James, and he was able to obtain employment. He was able to get his Social Security card. Now, granted, he lived at the time and this was first becoming a thing, but it was just through usage that he changed his name, and the reason to finalize that with the affidavit was just to connect it with the birth circumstance. It raises the interesting point that common law in this sort of usage consideration has other points of contact in our culture. So for instance, there is something called a common law marriage that essentially is a recognition through habit or repute of a marital relationship between two people who have never formally exchanged vows, but who have cohabitated together for a certain amount of time or lived together in a certain way, such that they can be considered to be lawfully wedded even without the formality. Or again, there's a similarity with respect to something that's sometimes called squatter's rights, where a person might obtain an easement to a property or even may gain title over that property after having lived or cared for it for a certain period of time. And finally, in trademark registration cannot be completed unless it can be shown that you have used the name that you're trying to trademark in commerce in some relevant sphere. Which is interesting, because you might think you would trademark the name first before you use it, but in fact the requirement is that you use it first and then trademark. But now we are in a somewhat more litigious society, and seemingly more and more so every day. There are a number of concerns. One of the concerns has to do with identity theft. This is a thing particularly with the advent of computer technology and information being stored on computer systems. But also considerations of terrorism and other kinds of crime has prompted certain scrutiny on certain name changes that may not have been applied in the past. So whereas my dad, who was born in 1930, changed his name through usage and didn't encounter any kind of a problem until, my mom started to kind of, ask some questions in the 70s. In this day and age, I'm recording this in 2019, it's a little bit different. And so the environment is different, and the scrutiny that is paid and the attention that is given to this kind of thing is going to be a little bit more in depth. And as I started off the video by saying, there's no sort of one-stop shop where you can just change your name and then in one place and then have it affect everything. But in fact, one of the corollaries of this culture that we live in is that it seems like we are moving towards a time when there may be some kind of centralized repository where you would change your name once and affect all of that. But in any case, the reason again why I tackled this particular topic was because of the circumstance that I thought was really interesting with respect to my dad. Again, he was born with one name, started living and working with another name, and it required an affidavit from his older sister, who was still alive at the time and predeceased him, in order to remedy this kind of a problem, so that it didn't issue in any difficulties in collecting Social Security or the like of this. So usually it's going to be government identification that poses the biggest problem. That would be things like Social Security, possibly driver's license, applying for veterans benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and these kinds of things. Government programs are probably going to be more scrutinous. And so it's best to have your ducks in a row. If something I said today was of interest, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. I have other more straightforward videos with respect to Alzheimer's than this one perhaps, but if you did enjoy it or get something out of it, again, those gestures of liking and subscribing do help out. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again.